Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted today to have a guest, an eminent guest, speaking to me from Jerusalem. Professor Gerald Steinberg is a professor of political science at the Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He's also the president of NGO Monitor. He's somebody who tracks proceedings in Israel very closely, provides a lot of commentary on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I invited the professor to have a conversation with me as this conflict becomes really a global, flashpoint in a sense, to try and understand how people in Israel are feeling about this, how Jews around the world are feeling about this, and what really has changed in our world because of this flashpoint conflict that many are now saying there could be a third world war. Is that apocalyptic? What really has changed? To discuss all of this, Professor Steinberg, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's important to explain to the world, to your audience, what we see going on here in our area.
Professor Steinberg, let me then begin by asking you exactly that. You said in your area, you live in Jerusalem. Talk to us a little bit about what people are feeling, thinking there, and what has changed.
In a certain sense, everything has changed since October 7th. On October 7th, we woke up to the sounds of sirens, of rockets being sent from Gaza to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, to all over the country. And then we gradually heard the terrible massacre, very brutal action, something that even though we've been at war for 75 years, most Israelis couldn't imagine. Nobody could imagine the type of brutality. We lost an estimated 1,500 people. We're a small country. We have only a population of about 9 million. And that's just, it's like somebody said, it's like 15 9/11s in the United States. So seeing the brutality, we've all gone to funerals. Many families have lost people. Some have not been identified. Their bodies burned to horribly to be unidentifiable. So we're in shock, or we were in shock, I'd say, slowly coming out of that shock and understanding the situation. And the situation that I think across the board, Israelis were arguing with each other for years about all sorts of other internal political issues, but there's a very strong sense of unity. Hamas has to be disarmed. Gaza has to be demilitarized. It's a small country. We're maybe an hour and a half hour drive from the border with Gaza on the south. We're about maybe 2.5 hour drive from the border with Lebanon and Syria in the north. It's a very small country, and we understand our vulnerability. So the first requirement, and everybody knows it, is to demilitarize Gaza, which is going to be extremely difficult and painful because it is one large terror base, underground, concrete tunnels everywhere. We all know people in the military. I'm too old to be in the military, but everybody who's younger in my family are been called up to reserve. So we all have that sense of this is going to be a very difficult war, a long war, we're told by our military. It's something that the military is practiced for. And we also have the threat, and occasionally, almost every day, some small battles going on because Iran has armed this proxy called Hezbollah, which controls Lebanon and has another 50, 60,000 rockets aimed at us from there. And they want to make life as difficult as possible to threaten Israel and to use that violence against us. So we're being prepared on all fronts, and that's a very difficult situation. I will just add that I think there is a greater sense of optimism now. We're beginning to come out of the shock, and we're beginning to see ways in which Israel will be able to prevail. Israelis who are old enough remember the situation both in 1948, 1967, 1973, where Israel was in a sense surrounded and very much threatened with being erased, and came out with a very strong victory. And that is also what Israelis now are looking towards. So it's that mix of shock, a sense of determination, and also a sense of that this will work out and perhaps will change the map in a way that is safer in the long term for everybody.
Talk to me a little bit, Professor, about what's happening in this, or has happened, is continuing to happen around the world. there's been this conversation about what is called proportional response. I wonder how people inside Israel and others who are concerned about what happened on October the 7th see this conversation that is happening in different parts of the world, especially in Western media, on proportional quote unquote response.
Israelis are very aware of what's being said and being written around the world, particularly in the West. It's part of the, I won't even say daily news, because Israel is 24/7 news right now. And part of that is always, every few hours, is what is being said in the media, in academic circles, demonstrations taking place in support of genocide, of destroying Israel, of Hamas. But your question, I think, is a very important one, because the influential parts of the world, the politically influential Western leadership, is in some ways supportive and in some ways betraying their principles and hypocritical. Lecturing Israel about proportionality, or telling Israel it has to be careful in its actions in Gaza so that it preserves Palestinian lives, is condescending, and it is arrogant. We have articles by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times telling Israel what he thinks. He's a journalist. He doesn't have any sense of the gravity of what's going on here. President Biden came here, and we've never had, in all of the years of war, we've never had an American president land while he can spend time in Israel, a day in Israel, talking to Israelis, meeting with the heads of government while we were in the middle of a war. The United States has sent warships, but at the same time, we're getting lectured by the Secretary of State and then slightly by the president also on this issue of proportionality. Proportionality is an invented concept. Most of international law, what they call international humanitarian law, is some sort of messianic Western dream, mythology, slogans. There was no proportionality in the response to the Nazi regime in World War II. German cities were bombed, firebombed to destruction, because that was how the West had to defeat Hitler. There's still an argument about the use of the atomic bomb against Japan, but the United States used the atomic bomb, they said, in order to save 1 million lives of soldiers. Lecturing Israel, or what we saw after 9/11, Iraq, all of those things, lecturing Israel about what it needs to do to preserve the lives of its citizens after this terrible massacre, inhuman barbarity, is something that Israelis also, who are part of the Israeli peace camp, are angry and resent. I think it is the message that's being sent from Israel is, you have no right to lecture us. And in fact, the ability of Hamas to wage war, and Hezbollah in the north, to a large degree is because of the neglect, because all of that is made from stolen humanitarian aid used to make this massive terror machine. At the end of the Lebanon war in 2006, which was between Hezbollah and Israel, Western leaders all gathered to say, we are going to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't rearm. I remember the president of France and others very solemnly coming and telling us, we are going to, you stop firing, stop the war, and we will guarantee your security by preventing Hezbollah from disarming. Completely ignored. The United Nations had peacekeepers. They do nothing. So this is not the time for anybody in the West to give, or anybody else to give Israel lectures. We are not going to disappear or allow ourselves to be murdered and massacred. And that's a very important message that the world needs to hear. We live in a very dangerous area, and we have to do what it takes. And if you, the West, are unable to prevent Iran and its proxies from carrying out these terrible attacks, we will defend ourselves.
I want to also talk to you a little bit about, we mentioned the press and also in many cases elite institutions. I want to talk to you about institutions from your own field, academia. Uh, people around the world, and including, of course, people in Israel, are watching what's happening in elite academic institutions in the West, especially in America. Tell us, Professor, since you're an academic yourself, what is your reading about what's going on there? You know, many of these institutions have been built with the money from very influential Jewish donors, entrepreneurs, business people, many other people who have made a lot of money in their professions have donated and built, in a sense, many of these institutions. How have these institutions become so skewed that, now that all of this has burst into the open, people almost seem to not be able to know, or people don't seem to understand how to handle this kind of extremism on college campuses?
I will admit that I am not shocked or surprised by this absolute betrayal of fundamental academic principles. I was a student at Berkeley in the 1970s, and I saw already there the impact, the penetration of ideology, of completely non-academic processes, what we now call postmodernism. There's no truth, there's no facts, there's no research. It's all context. Foucault is the hero. There are people in Diderot and others who are the heroes of what I call pseudo-academia. But I'm a minority, and I've been attacked and accused. I'm a political realist, perhaps because of my Jewish background, because my parents were both saved from the Nazi Germany. And I grew up with that knowledge that power corrupts, and power is what counts. And if somebody has power, it could be abused. And if you don't have power to defend yourself, you could be destroyed. And that's one of the most important principles that I come out of studying history in general and Jewish history in particular. Academia, the role of academics, has completely, as I said, rejected, neglected the fundamental principles of the search for truth, of experiment and open discussion. So on these campuses, Harvard University, and across what's called the Ivy League, Princeton, Yale, they give fellowships in human rights to propagandists like Kenneth Roth, who spent his entire life doing propaganda by claiming that he's an expert in human rights. It's all invented, but in academia, he has no academic credentials, and this happens all over the place, where the line between academia and ideology has disappeared. So there is a sense, those people who, the majority of academics, Israeli academics, Jewish academics, who call themselves part of the left, the enlightened left, the peace camp, have a very strong sense of betrayal. The word hypocrisy is used continuously. I will say that there is very strong pushback. We see that a number of those people, you talked about the donations that have been made to universities. And now those foundations and individuals are pulling out their money from Harvard, from Stanford, from Berkeley, and probably other institutions as well that I'm not following that closely. That's part of the response. But I think the most important response has to come from within the academic world. There has to be a fundamental change and a return to academic values, which is questioning, which is research, which is search for facts, which is being able to question all the theories that you have and try to analyze what's really going on in the world, and not say everything is contextual and everything is a matter of, if you have power, you are evil. That's really, in my view, the way 90% of academia today, that I can sum it up in that one phrase, which is absolutely ridiculous, absurd, and anti-academic. So yes, there's anger, betrayal, hypocrisy, all the things are together. but also a sense of determination to fight back. And I do see a strong response. There was that incident where a group of Harvard law students signed what was really an incredibly racist, anti-Semitic statement. And a group of law firms said, we are not going to, they withdrew job offers or internships. That is a sign of moral responsibility. And we need far more moral responsibility from outside academia to force the academics to change.
I also want to ask you, Professor, there was this map going around on social media which looked at all the places around Israel uh, where essentially Jews cannot live, and the tiny strip of land that's Israel. Um, Many people today are again talking about demography as a critical part. For all of Israel's might, demography is demography. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think people within Israel think about this issue? Because numbers, even on social media, the number of people who speak on a subject, we've come to a world where the more people talk about a subject, whether it's true or false, it doesn't matter. That becomes the truth. Demography seems to be, in a sense, against Jewish people. How do you think people within Israel and Jews around the world look at this issue?
I think you've summarized it exactly. We are 9 million Israelis, 7.5 million Jewish Israelis. We have a non-Jewish, Arab, both Muslim and Christian minority, divided amongst themselves into whether they identify themselves as Palestinians or Israelis. So we have within ourselves demographic issues. There are approximately, I believe now, 15 million people in the world who identify them as Jews, as Jewish. The number of Muslims is over 1 billion. We are very aware of that. There was a time, and I haven't given up on this, where there were Muslims who understood and accepted Israel and the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. I think, let me expand on that, and then I'll also talk about the Western world, the non-Muslim world that's out there too. Look, the world is very large, and India has a very large population of, I've forgotten, is it 2/3 is not Muslim, 1/3 is Muslim, roughly 2/3 Hindu. So it's not that we are going to be completely isolated in the world, but we do certainly, we are a small minority, a small sliver, as both demography and geography work against us, and those are absolute facts, as we said in the previous discussion. But let me start by talking about the Muslim and Arab environment. Israel, by United Nations resolution and by fighting for our rights in our homeland in 1948, became an independent state, defeated 5 Arab armies that far outnumbered us. And that was before the era of social media, what I call soft power warfare. That was Joseph Nye's term, and I think that's appropriate in this. Social media is certainly a major part of soft power. We are now, back in 1948, there were close to 900,000 Israelis, so we're now 10 times as many population. It's not, Israel is much more vulnerable then, and we learn from history. From 1948 to the first peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, we had no peace with any of our neighbors. We now have peace treaties with Egypt, one of the most populous Arab countries, with Jordan, with countries in the Gulf, UAE, Bahrain. We have a quasi-peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, and they have not broken those terms at all. They know that together we need to work together. And there's an acceptance of Israel as a small Jewish enclave, sovereign enclave in the region. Now that right now, I don't see that as changing. It depends partly on how we demonstrate our power to survive. And that may reinforce that sense that Israel is an important ally. So I think we are less isolated. I have correspondence, conversations, and I have to one of these days go to Dubai. I've been invited, or to the into that region where we share interests. We discuss shared interests, a lot of commerce, high tech, medical technology, space related research development is taking place between the oil-rich Gulf countries, particularly UAE, with Israeli input. Israel as the startup nation with this very major component of high tech. So while I agree with you on the demography and social media, I think we have to put it into proportion. That it is one factor. Soft power is not able to defeat hard power. It can make it more difficult. So Israel needs to build up its capabilities where we have those advantages, and that is in the high-tech sphere, that is in high power. And in social media, we have to do what we can. I do think that there is great mobilization. There's a lot more vocal Israeli, Zionist, pro-Israel, all those terms together, counter posting. It is no longer that, as it was maybe even 3 weeks ago, that the anti-Israel social media platforms have the absolute majority. In numbers, I agree with you in terms of the number of posts. One of the interesting things is that many of the posts that I see, and this may change in the next 10, 20 years, but they have very small numbers of followers. I have 12,000 followers. I don't work hard at getting followers on Twitter. I don't do much Facebook or other things, but I know that I have some impact. And I look for responding and interacting with responsible social media individuals who have significant following, not wasting response on people with 200 or 300 or 10 followers. So it's a matter of strategy. It's a long answer, but I think we need to be strategic. And if we're strategic, we can counter the demographic advantages that you pointed out, that the other side, the anti-Israel, the demonizers of Israel, the pro-Hamas part of the cyber world is able to use.
I'll come to the peace treaties that Israel has in just one moment. I want to discuss that and the future of the Abraham Accords with you. But before that, I want to touch upon something that you just mentioned, which made me think about something. You mentioned that there was a point in history that many people who were not Jewish also in the what we today call MENA, Middle Eastern, North African region, understood the need for Israel and the need for the Jews to have a homeland in the area and so on and so forth. It made me think of course, the East-West Orchestra that Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said had famously created, right? Bringing together Jewish musicians from Israel and Palestinian Muslim musicians to create one, orchestra to build, ties and understanding between people. Tell us a little bit about this moment, Professor, if you will, because this discourse has almost disappeared from our public discourse completely. No one talks about this. No one talks about this moment of understanding. Tell us a little bit about this moment of understanding and what made it special and what broke it.
I'm cautious about how much emphasis to put on what you call a moment of understanding. It's an interesting term. It didn't go very far. Let's look at a couple of points in history. I'll start with 1993 and the Oslo Accords and the images of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shaking hands reluctantly on the White House lawn, and a sense in Israel that we could slowly build a cooperative relationship with the Palestinians, that the bitter wars that had taken place had led to an understanding among Palestinians and Israelis that we should be able to live together. I should, I guess, go back to the earlier image of Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat, President of Egypt, Prime Minister Begin, shaking hands. And I wrote a book about how Menachem Begin went from being seen as a super hawk to the first Israeli leader to make peace with the most important Arab country in the world, which is Egypt, which is
Israel's
a fascinating
Nixon
story.
going to China moment, as we were taught.
All of those images. And in fact, here we are. That was in 1979. So that was about 45 years ago almost. And that peace treaty is held. And that's quite amazing. It is a very important sign. And then you have all the other elements. But the Palestinian, and this is the downside of that. Because after Arafat and Rabin shook hands, and we had these the agreements with thousands of pages with annexes of all sorts of details that lawyers spent years working on. But Arafat was not interested in a two-state side-by-side solution. And we lost, as a result of Arafat's terror campaign that began shortly afterwards, there were over 1,000 Israelis killed and many more wounded, mostly civilians, in these terrible bus bombings. The Israeli peace camp disappeared because they did not see among Palestinians a significant response. The peace orchestra type of images didn't go beyond a very small area because you could still see among Palestinian society the goal never changed, which was the elimination of Israel. In Arafat's speeches in Arabic, that was still the main theme. And Israelis, unlike Europeans, pay attention to what's said in Arabic. It's the West, it's the journalists in the New York Times and the BBC, it's European politicians and officials, to some degree, I would say progressive Democrat Americans, who see a very limited and optimistic and unrealistic view and don't see the ongoing incitement, genocidal incitement that led to what we see now in Gaza. I want to add one other quick point because we're talking in the shadow of this terrible war that was begun in the attacks against Israeli civilians 2.5 weeks ago. Israel withdrew from Israel. Let's go back. I'm going to go back quickly because I think it's important to connect the dots.
Also, the 2005 moment, I was going to come to
That's
that.
Exactly
also.
but I wanted to go back to 1948. Israel was attacked. After that war ended, Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Jordan occupied the West Bank, including Jerusalem, East Jerusalem or Old Jerusalem. And then in 1967, when the Nasser and the Syrians and Jordanians joined together to attack Israel, to what they said to continue the battles that had stopped with the ceasefire in 1949, no peace agreement against Israel. And Israel then conquered also the West Bank and Gaza. And Israel occupied Gaza between 1967 and 2005. In 2005, Israel withdrew every soldier, every civilian, every building, and handed it over to the Palestinian Authority, which had been created under Oslo. There was no Israeli presence in Gaza. But instead of using the opportunity to build a Palestinian status, as a number of Israeli politicians said, the Singapore, turning Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East, Palestinian Singapore, they turned into an armed terror base.
That's when the tunnels started getting built. Many of the tunnels got built at that time.
There was a Hamas coup in which they threw the Palestinian Authority's security people off of buildings in 2007 and took over and turned Gaza into a terror base with all the underground concrete tunnels and everything else. And that's what we're responding to. So that's part of the background here, where Israel made every gesture that it could to say we are willing to withdraw in return for a process of Palestinian state building. Palestinian leadership under Hamas, particularly said, we want to destroy you. Nothing's changed since 1948. And that's also what the United Nations, what's called Refugee Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, and all sorts of other UN agencies, they're paying over $1 billion US a year to sustain this myth of Palestinian refugees from 1948. There are a few thousand that are still alive from 1948. 75 years after the war, they could all have been resettled, built new lives, created a Palestinian Singapore. Israelis are very aware of this. For some reason, for various reasons, for what we discussed both in the academic world and the political world in the West, there's a blindness, there's a mythology that refuses to see the reality.
I want to talk to you a little bit about, since you mentioned refugees, what also astonishes many people around the world is that, states which were willing to go to war against Israel, states which are willing to put out very strident statements on behalf of Palestinians, where people in their tens of thousands seem to be gathered as protesters, yet would not take in quote unquote Palestinian refugees. Why would they not take in, Palestinian? Why doesn't Egypt take in more Palestinian refugees? Why doesn't the GCC states? Why doesn't Jordan, and so on and so forth? Explain this to our audience, because a lot of people don't understand this.
Since 1948, the Palestinian leadership, often supported by, and it changes over time, a lot of the Arab leaders, but not all, have been determined to use the refugee issue and this historical myth as a means of returning. They call it the Palestinian right of return, returning to what happened 75 years ago, which means returning to a situation where there was no Israel. And that is, it's a propaganda campaign. It's been fed by billions and billions of dollars. I go back to the UN agency. That's an artificial creation. There are natural disasters all over the world. There are wars all over the world. There's no place in the world where there is a unique United Nations agency funded at over $1 billion a year to maintain this artificial refugee status. There's a book called The War of Return, written by Einat Wilf and Yishai Schwartz, which I strongly recommend because it documents this history. And it's how Westerners who consider themselves to be the voices of humanitarianism, enlightenment, supporting the Palestinian refugee claims, have maintained these myths, which are really extremely lethal, because that's what powers the attacks like we saw on October 7th. So there is, I wouldn't say this is dominant. As I said before, I think that around the Middle East, there is a greater understanding that this is a very dangerous, destabilizing recipe for perpetual war around the region. And you still get the masses. Malaysia is thousands of kilometers away, and you have demonstrations in Malaysia calling for the destruction of Israel. And you ask yourself why that is. And a lot of that is a sort of religious hatred. A lot of it is powered by a lot of money and the United Nations and Western involvement, as I said before. But I'll look at the other half of the coin for a minute. Jordan, by the way, did take a lot of Palestinians. Jordan is more than half Palestinian, because there was really this identity of Palestinianism was really a British invention. For centuries, that area, which was called by the British Palestine, was part of southern Syria under the Ottoman Empire. And there was no difference there was all one area between the West Bank and Jordan. So there are lots of family connections and other things like that. There was also always a Jewish presence, a minority presence, but Jews have always been in this land. And the United Nations in 1947, November 1947, called for the partition, two-state formula. It was the Palestinian and Arab side that rejected it. But the Arab countries they see the Palestinians as destabilizing, as unable to govern themselves. So I'll let them speak for themselves, but Egypt doesn't want Palestinians in its land. It's got its own large population, which it cannot feed and has all sorts of difficulties in governing. Egyptians and Palestinians are two different peoples. In Jordan, the British establishes artificial, I might spend too much time, so I'll make this short. And I think in India, there's an understanding of the colonial heritage of the British, dividing of the British on the one hand, the French further north, creating these artificial boundaries. But the Jordanians, the Jordan royal family and the rulers of Jordan, they're imported from Saudi Arabia and Iraq. They haven't been there for even barely 100 years. So these are artificial creations, and they know it. So too many Palestinians destabilizes Jordan. So you don't really have a government there. You have sort of a set of puppets that are barely trying to hang on. Each country, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, all these countries do not want Palestinians to be in large numbers because they are a source of instability. Palestinians need to take responsibility for themselves. That's another quick point I want to make. And that is when the West, the United Nations, Europe, the United States under the current administration, Canadian government treats Palestinians as children without agency. They cannot govern themselves. We have to help them. We don't take seriously. We don't even pay attention to what they say about destroying Israel. They're victims. And that kind of closing out of the real world is another source of the maintenance of this conflict. I don't know, I assume we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to go to a big picture type of point. Which you probably were going to ask me about anyway, but I'll do it. And that is, this may be a turning point. I'm an optimist. I wouldn't be living here if I wasn't, and doing what I do. Despite everything that I said, I'm an optimist that eventually people come to their senses, that the real world eventually imposes itself on all these groups that we talked about and destroys their ideological myths.
Let me take this point and ask you about the future of the Abraham Accords then, because you're talking about optimism, and the Abraham Accords were seen as this rare moment of optimism, a move forward. It seemed like Israel was quickly being able to stitch up, peace negotiations and peace treaties, even with neighbors or countries in the region which may have traditionally been hostile to it, in deals brokered in a sense by America. What is the future, according to you, of such deals, including the Abraham Accords?
If Israel comes out of this conflict stronger, the Abraham Accords will be much stronger. The major factor behind there are a lot of shared interests. This was not simply an American orchestrated framework, not at all. Most of these agreements existed quietly for dozens of years before because there are mutual interests. There are economic interests, but most importantly, security interests. Gulf states, small Gulf states, oil-rich Gulf states that cannot protect themselves and are not sure the United States is a reliable partner, want to have Israeli support and those kinds of connections. Because Iran is the common enemy throughout the region. If Iran comes out of this conflict weakened because its allies in Gaza lose their military capability, I don't believe in destroying Hamas. I don't think that the political leadership may survive But if they have no terror capability, it's irrelevant. If Hezbollah is significantly weakened or shown that it is a paper tiger, I use that term carefully because I think that's overly simplistic. But if Israel can deter Iran here or defeat Iran if necessary, its proxies, then the Gulf states will see Israel as a much more important source of power. And if the United States continues to act in a strong way, shot down a number of cruise missiles sent by Iranian proxies to the Red Sea rather, towards Israel, and has sent aircraft carriers and warned Hezbollah. So what we're seeing is the buildup of or the strengthening of an existing alliance, which is the basis for the Abraham Accords. And you add to that the fact that there are strong economic interests, shared interests, the high-tech element, the medical element. This is the emergence of a Middle Eastern-centered, smaller power base, but one that can take its place in the world as having a significant role and not be simply responding passively to Western or Chinese or Russian influence. And by the way, India is part of that process. I've forgotten the name of the framework where there's shared intelligence and defense planning, security planning. If you look at geography, counts not quite as much as demography, but it counts. So the first time when I went to India, it was for a security conference involving Israelis and Indians and others as well from the region. And because we share a lot of with our shared threats and also basis for cooperation. The number of, when I fly to India and I see the planes are full of high-tech people and entrepreneurs and tourists, but that shared interests. And India is a pivotal part of that. India is in the middle, really. And we work closely together. And I think that alliance is one also based on interests and shared values. And that's very important as well.
I have one last question then for you, Professor, if I may, which is, unless they are history enthusiasts, it's almost as if social media has forgotten the history of the Jewish people in the disputed land, so to speak, and only one part of the history is remembered. I've been tweeting about King Solomon's temple and so on and so forth, but a lot of people don't seem to remember these things. As an academic, as a professor, could you give us a sense of how long Jewish history has been in this land, and the Jewish claim, in a sense, for 1,000 years the Jews said next year in Jerusalem. Why did they say that? And what kind of claims the Jewish people have on this land?
It's a 4,000-year history, and I'm talking to people I'm talking to you, someone who lives in India, and talking to the rest of the world. That's a lot of history. And it's recorded in the Hebrew Bible. We have the history going back. We have bits and pieces that we know about, obviously a lot we don't, but we have these texts, these historical religious texts, which at least are 3,000 years. They talk about events that are maybe 4,000 years, but 3,000, and the evidence is very clear. So I, as a Jew, my parents were born in Germany. My grandparents, one of my grandfather was born in Poland, but we were always, as you said, we were Jews in exile. We lost our sovereignty against the Romans 2,000 years ago, but we've preserved the sense, and I guess in some ways uniquely. You said we say next year in Jerusalem, and that's very much built in. We speak the Hebrew language. I learned some Hebrew before I was able to speak English. I teach my classes in Hebrew. My students speak Hebrew. We are 9 million Israelis who speak Hebrew. That's a very ancient language with a amazingly rich literature, history, going back through all those years. And we've carried that thread all the way through. This is our homeland. You cannot understand the importance of Hebrew without living in this land, because all of the words related to nature, to agriculture, they're all indigenous as we are to this land, even though we have wandered around the world being pushed here and there without being able to defend ourselves. That's actually a very good point to end on. I sometimes think that many of our critics or the condescending people who give us advice do not understand the depth to which we, as the Jewish people, see ourselves as indigenous to this land. And we are not, after 2,000 years of having been unable, for most of the time, to live here, to visit here. Now that we're back, we're not going anywhere. We're not going to be defeated. Any violence that's thrown against us will be met with equal and greater violence. If the world wants to prevent a massive war, then it has to stop the attacks, the hatred against Israel, and start working with Palestinians who are willing to accept the existence of Israel as legitimate. And then we can get into, again, we can try to resume the language of compromise and expand this framework of we're here and you're here and we can work together, but that will take some generations. It won't happen overnight because there's just no basis in Palestinian society. That basis has been neglected, and we need to build that.
Are you
But we're
still
not going anywhere.
optimist about the two-state solution, Professor?
I don't use the term solution. And I do not see this as coming about in anything less than a generation or two, because the first thing that has to happen is that all those Palestinian textbooks and classes that say Israel stole our land and the Jews don't have a history here, that has to be uneducated. And that's going to take a generation or two. So I'm fine with leaving that goal as something we want to work towards, but it's not going to happen in any kind of magic instant formula.
L. Steinberg, thanks very much for joining me from Jerusalem and taking me through in such great detail many of the issues about Israel today after that fateful attack on October the 7th, all the things that Israel is doing legitimately to protect itself, the conflict that's now underway, and indeed lots of great pointers about how Israeli society and Jews in general are thinking about the future of their land and their people. Thank you very much. I can only, as an Indian, repeat what my Prime Minister Narendra Modi has already said, that India will always stand by Israel against any terror attack. India will not, cannot, with its own history, ever support terror attacks, barbaric terror attacks in any place in the world, especially not at Israel, an old friend. Thank you very much, Professor Steinberg, for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it as well.